everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'm going to be showing you a little bit about modifying patterns to exclude a shoulder seam. There are some patterns that this works really well for, and some that it won't work quite as well for, but it's still a really easy modification, and it's really important for small dolls. I'm doing this a little bit differently because I just recently got a cable that lets me hook my microphone directly to my DSLR. So instead of doing something scripted, I am going to do my best to wing this and explain the process as I go. So I have a couple patterns here that are things that I've made, and I'll explain a little bit about why you might want to remove the shoulder seam, which is something that I've already done on this pattern. As you can see, this is really small, and having a shoulder seam would mean that you have to have really tiny seam margins there to avoid bulkiness, especially on a doll this tiny. And it also means that if you do a lining, this will be a whole lot easier to turn right side out. So this is the vest pattern that I recently made available on my site for quarter scale boys. And I'm going to first show you that you'll need to mark the seam allowance on your pattern. So that's roughly a quarter, and I'm just going to roughly sketch it in because it doesn't need to be perfect just for example's sake. But you'll want to mark that on both the front and the back, like so, because this is the point that you're going to line up. So removing the shoulder seam means that your garment is going to be just one piece, and that works really well for some fabrics and not so well for patterns. So if you're using like stripes or checks or something, this may not be the best choice. But if it's solid color, it can make your life a lot easier. See, I marked the wrong shoulder at first, but that's okay. So the first thing you do is mark the shoulder seam, and then you're going to line up those lines together, like that. This basically just removes the extra allowance right there so that the shoulder will fit properly. And then you're just going to trace that onto a new piece of paper. This piece of paper is just like regular printer paper, so it's not going to fit on there completely, but I can give you a rough idea of what it'll look like. You don't need any special tools for this, just like a ruler and a pencil. I like using a cheap mechanical pencil, but you can use anything you want. Sometimes I also use markers when I'm drawing patterns, just because I like to make them colorful. If it's easier for you, you can put tape at the shoulder. Washi tape is really good for it because it peels back off easily. But I did not bring any up to my studio with me, and I've already started, so I don't really want to go all the way downstairs to get my box of washi tape. So this is one half. And then going the other way, I'd flip this over, and I could tape a piece of paper on this side, but I'm not going to since this is just an example. Oops, I totally did not trace the neck. Good job. From here you can see there's a little bit of roughness. That can just be sketched out to even it out. And now this is just like a single piece. Much like this, that means that it can just be cut out all at once, and then there's not going to be any bulk to worry about at those shoulder seams. But it's still going to be fitted across the shoulder and around the arms. Now, it is important to remember that this is going to work better in some instances than others. It's really important to have the slope on the shoulder seam, because if it's squared like this, it won't work nearly as well. Partly because the front piece here has a seam allowance, and that means that it's wider than half the width of the back. So on a pattern like this with the squared shoulder, if you tried to line it up at the shoulder like that, you're going to find that there's not enough space for that seam allowance on the front piece. These two pieces would end up overlapping. There are some slight adjustments that you can make that'll make it possible, such as rotating it so that the front pieces will be angled off, but that does affect the fit around the arm, so you want to make sure to enlarge the armhole in that case so that it'll still fit around your doll's arm. And if you do that, you'll obviously want to make a test garment using a piece of scrap fabric or something just to ensure that it fits the way you want it. Another great thing about eliminating the shoulder seam so that you have fewer pieces is that it will enable you to create a yoke that makes a facing on your pattern piece so that you don't have to do a full lining. If you're not familiar with yokes, I use them in patterns occasionally, especially on things like this little sundress. You can see I've got this really neat finished edge around the neckline, but it would be really bulky to have a full lining in something like this that's supposed to be light and airy. So instead, we use a yoke, which goes only around that raw edge. Adding a facing is really easy. You would just start by tracing out your pattern piece and then drawing on top of it to mark where you need that new piece to be. That way you're guaranteed that it's going to be a perfect fit. This part here is all I'm really looking for, something to go along this back opening and around the neckline, so I don't need to draw more than that. So for this, I'm just going to do a simple rounded facing piece here. Just lightly sketching. And this is for like a Pookie sized outfit, so I do these by hand and don't need a full quarter inch seam allowance, so it can be a little bit smaller when I do things by hand because I'm much more precise. See, that's really easy. And now if I were to sew this with this yoke facing on the inside, I would end up with a really neat and tidy seam line right here. And down the back. It's also possible to add a facing to something like this vest pattern if you're really concerned about bulkiness. And it would basically be the same thing. You would just trace this onto another piece of paper and then draw wherever you want that facing to be. Facings are really nice because they don't have to be perfectly finished. They can just be a raw edge, or you can use pinking shears on it to deter fraying, or you can treat it with fray check so that it doesn't have any bulk at all. It would just lay flat on the inside. So this would be a perfect facing for the front edge and the neckline of this vest. And it's also possible to add a facing along the armhole. So if you're not very confident about doing full linings, you can definitely add a facing in both of these places. There's a little bit of overlap here where I sketched it out, but normally you would make these two separate pieces. Anyway, that's all I have for you this time, just a quick little simple tutorial on pattern modification. I hope you find it useful. It's definitely something that can be used with patterns that I've made available, so if you end up using it for something, be sure to let me know in the comments so I can check it out. And that's all for today though. Thanks for joining me again. Bye.